The Valorian Empire had ruled the stars for 300 years, and their military force had crushed every civilization that stood in their way. They had conquered 14 star systems and enslaved countless species across the galaxy. Their ships were massive, and their weapons could turn entire planets into dust. No one had ever defeated them in battle, and no one had ever dared to refuse their demands. When their long-range scanners detected a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star, they saw nothing but another easy victory waiting to happen. Commander Zelthar stood tall on the bridge of his flagship and watched the planet called Earth grow larger on his screens. He had 4 arms and a body covered in thick armor plates that had evolved over millions of years. His species had climbed to the top of the food chain on their home world, and then climbed to the top of the galaxy itself. This new planet looked weak and primitive and completely unprepared for what was coming. The invasion fleet moved through space like a swarm of metal locusts, and each ship was the size of a mountain. 300 warships traveled together in perfect formation, and their engines left trails of blue light across the darkness. Commander Zelthar had commanded many invasions before, and this one seemed like it would be the easiest of all. His scouts had reported that the humans were still bound to their single planet, and had barely begun to explore their own solar system. They used primitive rockets that burned chemical fuel, and their weapons were simple explosives and metal projectiles. It would be like crushing insects under his boot. The commander gathered his officers in the war room and displayed a hologram of Earth floating above the table. Cities glowed like tiny sparks across the continents, and thin lines showed where the humans had built their roads and connections. It looked so fragile and small compared to the mighty Valorian civilization. We will give them one chance to surrender peacefully, and if they refuse, we will demonstrate our power by destroying one of their major cities. After they see what our weapons can do, they will beg for mercy and accept their place as subjects of the Empire. This conquest will take less than a day, and we will move on to the next system by tomorrow. His officers clicked their mandibles in agreement and returned to their stations. The fleet moved closer to Earth and took up positions in orbit around the planet. Their sensors began scanning the surface and cataloging the human population centers and military installations. Everything they saw confirmed what they already believed. These humans were children playing with toys, while the Valorians were gods wielding the power of stars. On Earth, the detection happened almost instantly at multiple locations around the globe. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat at his station deep inside Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado and stared at his screen in complete shock. The readings made no sense at first because nothing that large should be able to move through space at those speeds. 300 massive objects had appeared beyond the moon and were heading directly toward Earth in a coordinated pattern that could only mean one thing. Jake reached for his phone with shaking hands and called his commanding officer. "We have incoming, and they are not friendly. Get me General Hayes right now, because this is what we have been preparing for." Within 15 minutes, every major military command center on Earth was on high alert. At the Pentagon in Washington, the Joint Chiefs assembled in their command room and watched satellite feeds showing the alien fleet. At the United Nations building in New York, Ambassador Richard Cole received urgent calls from every major nation demanding answers and action. At NASA headquarters in California, Dr. Lisa Bennett confirmed what everyone feared. These were artificial constructs, and they were not from Earth, and they were coming here with obvious hostile intent. The message arrived 6 hours later and broadcast across every radio, frequency, and television channel on the planet. The Valorians had somehow learned human languages by intercepting broadcasts and satellites during their approach. The voice that spoke was cold and mechanical, and translated into every major language simultaneously. "People of Earth, you are now property of the Valorian Empire. Your governments will surrender immediately, and your military forces will stand down. You will accept our rule and serve the Empire as all conquered species must. Resistance is futile, and will result in the complete destruction of your civilization. You have 12 hours to comply with our demands, or we will begin destroying your cities, one by one, until you submit." In homes and buildings across the planet, people stopped what they were doing and stared at their screens in disbelief and fear. Some panicked and fled to shelters, while others gathered with family and waited to see what would happen next. Religious leaders prayed and politicians argued, and children cried in their parents' arms. The world held its breath and waited for their leaders to respond. Deep beneath the White House in the Situation Room, President Margaret Sullivan sat at the head of a long table surrounded by the most powerful military and intelligence leaders in the nation. The room was designed to survive a nuclear war, and now it would serve as command center for something even more dangerous. President Sullivan had been briefed years ago about the possibility of alien contact, but knowing it could happen and seeing it actually unfold were two very different things. She looked around the table at the faces of men and women who had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. General Vincent Hayes sat to her right, and his weathered face showed no fear, only determination. Admiral Christine Ford sat across from him, and her eyes were focused and calculating. Director Paul Sanders from the CIA had files spread in front of him containing intelligence gathered over 70 years of secret research and preparation. Tell me what we have, and tell me if we can win this fight. President Sullivan spoke calmly, but her words carried the weight of 8 billion lives depending on her decisions. General Hayes leaned forward and began speaking in a steady, confident voice. Madam President, we have been preparing for this day since 1947, when we recovered our first alien craft in New Mexico. Everything the public knows about our space program is only half the truth. We have been building weapons and ships in secret for decades using technology we recovered and improved upon. Our orbital defense network has been active for 5 years disguised as communication satellites. We have ships hidden on the far side of the moon waiting for our command to launch. We have weapons that these Valorians have never seen before, and tactics they cannot predict. Admiral Ford nodded and added her assessment. We have 48 orbital weapons platforms capable of generating energy beams that can cut through solid titanium like butter. We have 16 combat spacecraft built in lunar shipyards and crewed by pilots who have trained their entire careers for space combat. We also have ground-based systems that can reach orbit and beyond. The Valorians think we are primitive, but they are about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating humanity. Director Sanders spoke up, and his voice was quiet but firm. Our intelligence suggests this fleet is a standard conquest force, not their full military strength. They send overwhelming force to intimidate and crush resistance quickly. They have done this hundreds of times before, and it has always worked. But they have never fought humans before, and they do not understand what makes us different from every other species they have encountered. President Sullivan listened to every word and considered the magnitude of what was about to happen. If they fought and lost, then humanity would be enslaved or destroyed. If they surrendered without fighting, then they would definitely be enslaved and lose any chance of freedom forever. The choice was clear, even if the outcome was uncertain. Send them our response. Tell the Valorian Empire that Earth does not accept their offer and will never bow to any foreign power. Tell them that if they want our world, they will have to take it from our cold, dead hands. Show them that humanity does not surrender, and we will fight to the last breath to protect our home. The message was sent, and the Valorians received it with a mixture of surprise and amusement. No species had ever refused their first offer before, and Commander Zelthar actually laughed when he read the human response. These primitive creatures thought they could resist the might of the Empire. He would teach them the price of defiance and make an example of their world that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. Deploy attack formation and target their largest city. Fire one warning shot with minimal power and let them watch their buildings melt. After they see what we can do, they will beg us to accept their surrender. The Valorian fleet moved into attack position above Earth, and their weapons began charging with energy drawn from antimatter reactors. Targeting computers locked onto New York City and calculated the perfect angle for maximum visual impact and minimal actual damage. This was meant to be a demonstration, not a massacre. The real destruction would come later if the humans continued to resist, but the Valorians had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that any species still confined to one planet must be technologically inferior. They assumed that humans would be like all the other species they had conquered. They assumed that Earth had no defenses and no way to fight back. In less than 60 seconds, they would learn how wrong they were, and by then it would be far too late to retreat. The Valorian flagship began charging its main plasma weapon, and the energy buildup was so massive that it created a visible glow around the ship that could be seen from Earth with telescopes. Commander Zelthar watched his screens with satisfaction as the targeting solution locked onto the center of New York City. He would fire just one shot at reduced power and vaporize a few city blocks to show the humans what real weapons looked like. After they saw their towers melting and their people dying, They would abandon any foolish thoughts of resistance. The weapon reached full charge and Zelthar gave the command to fire. A brilliant beam of superheated plasma erupted from the flagship and streaked toward Earth at incredible speed. The beam carried enough energy to turn steel into vapor and concrete into glass. It would hit the surface in less than 3 seconds and create a crater visible from space, but the beam never reached the ground. Every sensor array and detection system on Earth had been tracking the energy buildup in the Valorian ship. Lieutenant Jake Morrison at Peterson Space Force Base saw the weapon charging and immediately sent the activation signal, high above Earth in orbital, positions that the Valorians had completely failed to detect. Something extraordinary happened. 48. Objects that had appeared to be ordinary, communications satellites suddenly transformed. Panels slid open and hidden apertures emerged and began glowing with accumulated energy. The satellites were not satellites at all, but weapons platforms that had been placed in orbit over 5 years and disguised to look harmless. Each platform contained a directed energy weapon more powerful than anything humanity had ever built before, and they had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. The orbital defense grid came alive and calculated firing solutions in microseconds using quantum computers that processed faster than any Valorian system. All 48 platforms rotated as one and locked onto the incoming plasma beam. They fired together, and their combined energy output was staggering. An interceptor beam lanced upward from the defense grid and met the Valorian plasma lance 300 miles above the Earth. The collision created a flash of light so bright that it looked like a second sun had appeared in the sky. People across the eastern United States looked up and saw the explosion and wondered if the world was ending. But the plasma dissipated harmlessly into the upper atmosphere, and not a single building in New York was damaged. On the bridge of his flagship, Commander Zelthar stood frozen in shock. That should have been impossible. These humans had technology that his sensors had not detected, and weapons that could intercept his most powerful attack. Before he could process what had just happened, the situation became much worse. The 48 orbital platforms did not stop firing after intercepting the plasma beam. They immediately retargeted and locked onto the nearest Valorian ships. 48 beams of pure energy lanced upward at the speed of light and struck their targets before any Valorian crew could react or take evasive action. The beams hit shields that were designed to withstand nuclear weapons and plasma fire. For 3 seconds, the shields held and glowed bright blue as they absorbed massive amounts of energy. Then the shields failed and collapsed and the beam struck bare hull. Valorian ships were built with armor that could resist almost any weapon. But these beams were not almost any weapon. They cut through the alien metal like hot knives through butter. 6 Valorian warships exploded in the first 5 seconds of combat. Their reactors overloaded from the damage and detonated with the force of small nuclear bombs. 8 more ships were crippled and venting atmosphere and debris into space. Valorian crews that had expected an easy victory suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. Commander Zelthar screamed orders at his crew. Evasive maneuvers now and return fire on those platforms. Destroy them before they can fire again. All ships scatter and attack the Valorian. Fleet broke formation and hundreds of ships began firing back at Earth. Plasma, lances and kinetic projectiles and missile swarms poured toward the orbital defense grid. The platforms were powerful, but they were also stationary targets, and the Valorians had thousands of weapons to throw at them. Several platforms exploded under the concentrated fire and tumbled out of orbit as burning wreckage, but humanity had more surprises waiting. The moon, which had seemed empty and lifeless, suddenly came alive with activity. On the far side of the lunar surface, hidden from Earth and from the Valorian sensors, enormous hangar doors slid open. 16 combat spacecraft emerged from concealed bases that had been built over decades in absolute secrecy. The ships were called Sentinels, and they had been designed for one single purpose, which was to fight and win battles in the vacuum of space against technologically advanced enemies. Captain Daniel Wright sat in the command chair of the lead ship, which was named Freedom. Around him, his crew of 80 men and women worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. They had trained for years in simulators and in actual space flights that the public had never known about. Every person on the Sentinel ships had volunteered, knowing that they might be called to fight a war that could mean the extinction of the human race. All ships execute attack pattern Sierra and focus your fire on their command vessels. We are going to cut the head off this invasion force right now. Captain Wright spoke calmly into his communication system, and his orders were received by the other 15 Sentinel ships. The Sentinel fleet accelerated toward the Valorian formation at speeds that should have killed any living crew. The G-forces were tremendous, even with inertial dampening systems running at full power. But humanity had solved the physics differently than the Valorians had. Where the aliens used gravity manipulation to reduce inertia, the humans used quantum field technology that allowed their ships to ignore certain laws of physics temporarily. The result was ships that could make turns and accelerations that would tear any Valorian vessel apart. The Freedom Dove, straight through the middle of the Valorian formation and twisted and rolled between incoming plasma fire. Valorian gunners tried to track the human ship, but it moved too fast and changed direction too quickly. The Freedom fired its railguns and launched tungsten projectile rounds that had been accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. Each round carried kinetic energy equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. 3 rounds struck a Valorian destroyer and punched straight through its shields and armor. The impacts were so violent that they shattered the internal structure of the ship and caused its reactor to explode. The destroyer came apart in a ball of fire and debris. All across the battle space, the other Sentinel ships were doing the same thing. They moved like dancers through the enemy formation and fired their weapons with deadly accuracy. Valorian ships exploded or were crippled one after another. The aliens had superior numbers and their individual ships were larger and more heavily armed, but they could not hit targets that moved, like the human vessels did. Commander Zelthar watched, his fleet being torn to pieces, and felt something he had never experienced before in his long military career. He felt fear. These humans were not primitives at all. They had been waiting and preparing and hiding their true capabilities. His fleet had walked straight into a trap. All ships retreat to minimum jump distance immediately. We need to call for reinforcements and report what we have encountered here. The Empire must know that these humans are dangerous. The Valorian ships that were still functional tried to disengage from combat and move away from Earth. Their faster than light drives needed several minutes to charge, and they needed to be far enough from Earth's gravity well to make the jump safely. But humanity had anticipated this move as well. Throughout near-Earth space, in carefully calculated positions, hundreds of small objects suddenly activated. They had been floating dormant and invisible to sensors for months. Now they came alive and began their terminal countdown. Each object was a fusion mine with a yield of 5 megatons. The mines detonated in a pattern that had been designed by the best military strategists on Earth. Hundreds of nuclear fireballs bloomed across space and created an expanding wall of destruction and electromagnetic pulses. Valorian ships that were trying to escape flew directly into the blast zones. The electromagnetic pulses were devastating to the alien technology. Valorian ships depended on delicate quantum systems to control their faster-than-light drives, and the pulses fried those systems instantly. Ships that had been preparing to jump away suddenly found themselves stranded and unable to leave the solar system. The Sentinel fleet pressed their advantage and continued hunting down Valorian vessels. The orbital defense platforms that had survived the initial exchange kept firing at any ship that came into range. Earth had turned its entire orbital space into a killing field. Captain Wright guided the Freedom through the debris and wreckage of destroyed ships. His tactical officer called out targets and his gunners fired with mechanical precision. Another Valorian cruiser exploded under concentrated railgun fire. A destroyer tried to ram the Freedom in a desperate attack, but Wright rolled his ship at the last second and the destroyer missed by meters before being cut in half by fire from another Sentinel. The battle raged for 40 minutes and turned into a complete slaughter. The Valorian invasion fleet had come with 300 warships expecting to conquer a primitive planet. Instead, they found themselves being systematically destroyed by an enemy that fought with ferocity and skill they had never encountered before. Commander, Zelthar sat in his ruined command chair and watched the last of his escorts explode on his flickering screens. His flagship was dying around him. Life support had failed and hull breaches were venting atmosphere into space. Half his crew was dead and the other half would be soon. He could see Earth through the cracked view screen and it looked beautiful and terrible at the same time. He activated his emergency transmitter and sent one final message on all frequencies, hoping someone would hear it. The Valorian Empire has underestimated humanity, and we have paid the ultimate price. These warriors are unlike any we have faced before. All remaining ships stand down and surrender. We have lost this battle completely. 16 Valorian ships that were still intact powered down their weapons and shields in the universal signal of surrender. They were taken into custody by Sentinel crews and towed to holding positions. The rest of the invasion fleet was nothing but floating wreckage and frozen bodies drifting through the void. Earth had won its first battle against an alien empire, and the victory was total and absolute. The captured Valorian ships floated in orbit around Earth like defeated giants, and human boarding teams moved through their corridors with weapons ready. Admiral Christine Ford watched the operation from her command center aboard Space Station Guardian, which had suddenly become visible to the world now that secrecy no longer mattered. The station had been built in orbit over 10 years and disguised as a collection of different satellites, but now everyone could see it for what it truly was, which was a massive military fortress bristling with weapons and sensors. Down on Earth, the news channels were broadcasting non-stop coverage of the battle and showing footage that had been captured by satellites and ground telescopes. The entire world had watched as their planet was attacked, and then watched as their hidden military forces revealed themselves and destroyed the alien fleet. Social media exploded with millions of posts and videos, and people demanding answers about why this had been kept secret for so long. President Margaret Sullivan sat in the Oval Office preparing to address not just her nation but the entire world. She knew that what she said in the next few minutes would shape human history for generations to come. Her advisors had written several versions of the speech, but she had thrown them all away and decided to speak from her heart instead. She looked directly into the camera as it went live and began speaking in a calm, steady voice that carried authority and honesty. My fellow citizens of Earth, and I speak to all of you regardless of what nation you call home or what language you speak. Today we were attacked by an alien empire that believed we were weak and defenseless. They were wrong about us. For more than 70 years, the governments of this world have known that we were not alone in the universe. We recovered alien technology in 1947, and we have spent every year since then studying it and learning from it and preparing for the day when we might need to defend ourselves. She paused and let her words sink in before continuing. Some of you will ask why this was kept secret, and the answer is simple. We needed time to understand what we were facing and time to build defenses that could protect our world. We needed time to work together across national boundaries and set aside our differences to focus on our survival as a species. Today, that preparation saved billions of lives. Today, humanity proved that we are not prey for any alien empire that thinks they can conquer us. Around the world, people watched and listened, and opinions were divided. Some were angry about the secrecy and felt betrayed by their governments. Others were grateful that someone had been thinking ahead and preparing for this threat. But most people simply felt relief that they were still alive and that Earth had survived. Its first contact with hostile aliens at the lunar shipyard's Captain Daniel Wright and his crew were already preparing for what would come next. The Sentinel pilots knew that this battle was just the beginning and not the end. Intelligence officers were working around the clock to extract information from the captured Valorian ships, and what they found was deeply troubling. Dr. Lisa Bennett led the team, analyzing the alien computer systems and communication logs. She had learned the Valorian language with the help of translation software cobbled together from their technology. What she discovered made her call an emergency meeting with Admiral Ford and General Vincent Hayes. The three of them sat in a secure conference room, and Dr. Bennett displayed her findings on a holographic screen. According to the communication logs in their ships, the Valorian Empire controls 14 star systems and has a total military force of over 10,000 warships. The fleet we just destroyed was only 300 ships, which means we have eliminated roughly 3% of their total military strength. General Hayes leaned back in his chair and absorbed the implications. How long before they realize their fleet is missing and send reinforcements? Dr. Bennett pulled up another display showing the Valorian communication network. Their faster-than-light communication uses quantum entanglement, but it requires relay stations positioned throughout space. The nearest relay station to Earth is approximately 6 light-years away. A message would take about 2 months to reach that relay, and then travel back to their core systems. After that, they will need time to assemble another fleet and travel here. My best estimate is that we have 4 to 6 months before they return. Admiral Ford stood and walked to the window where she could see Earth hanging in space like a blue jewel. 4 months to prepare for a war against an enemy that outnumbers us 30 to 1. We need to use every second wisely. The decision was made to accelerate every defensive program and share technology that had been kept secret even from most government officials. President Sullivan issued executive orders that restructured the entire global economy toward preparation for war. Factories were retooled to produce weapons and ship components. Resources were redirected from civilian projects to military needs. The world's best scientists and engineers were recruited into programs that had previously been top secret. But humanity had one advantage that the Valorians did not understand. Humans were incredibly good at adapting and innovating under pressure. When faced with extinction, people found ways to survive that seemed impossible. Dr. Henry Clark worked at a secret facility in Nevada that the public knew as Area 51. His team had been reverse engineering alien technology for decades, but now they had actual Valorian ships to study. What they discovered changed everything. Dr. Clark presented his findings to the military leadership in a briefing that would reshape Earth's strategy. The Valorian power systems use contained fusion reactions, which is solid proven technology, but it has limitations. We have been experimenting with zero-point energy extraction, which pulls power directly from quantum vacuum fluctuations. If we can scale this up to ship size, our vessels could generate 3 times the power output of equivalent Valorian ships. More power means stronger shields and more powerful weapons, and faster engines. The lunar shipyards went into overdrive. Production and new construction facilities were built in orbit around Earth. Automated mining operations were established in the asteroid belt to harvest raw materials. What had taken decades to build in secret now happened in weeks with the full resources of humanity behind it. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell was one of the Sentinel pilots who had fought in the first battle. She attended a meeting where military planners discussed their options, and she raised a concern that everyone was thinking about. Better technology is great, but they still outnumber us by a massive margin. We cannot win by building better ships alone. We need to build more ships, and we need them fast. Martin Hughes was the CEO of a defense contractor called Stellar Dynamics that had been building spacecraft components in secret for 20 years. He stood up and addressed the room with confidence. We are expanding the lunar shipyards to 10 times their current capacity. We are also building new construction facilities at the Earth-Moon Lagrange points. With the asteroid belt providing resources and with new automated construction systems, we can build ships faster than any projection said was possible. But we need time, and we need every nation on Earth working together. President Sullivan made another historic decision and announced it in a speech to the United Nations. Effective immediately, we are sharing all defensive technology with every nation willing to contribute to Earth's protection. This is no longer about individual countries or political systems. This is about human survival.
Any nation that wants to help build ships or weapons or defenses will receive the technology and training to do so.
We either stand together or we fall separately. The response was overwhelming, and nations that had been enemies for decades suddenly found themselves working side by side. Russian engineers worked with American scientists. Chinese factories produced components designed by European researchers. Indian programmers wrote software that controlled Japanese-built weapon systems. The old divisions and conflicts did not disappear completely, but they were set aside in the face of a threat that made them seem trivial. Universities around the world established new programs in xenotechnology and space warfare. Students who had been studying literature or business suddenly switched to engineering and physics. Children in schools learned about the solar system not as distant objects, but as places where humans now lived and worked. The entire civilization transformed in ways that would have taken centuries under normal circumstances. Not everyone supported the changes, and protests erupted in some major cities. People were afraid of the militarization of space and worried about the costs and concerned about losing the peaceful world they had known. But polls showed that more than 70% of Earth's population supported the defense initiatives. Most people understood that the alternative to preparation was conquest and slavery. By the end of the 4th month, Earth's defensive capabilities had grown beyond what anyone thought possible. The Sentinel fleet had expanded from 16 ships to 80 ships. The orbital defense grid now had 300 weapons platforms instead of 48. New weapon systems had been tested and deployed, including the Aegis array, which was a network of quantum-entangled weapons platforms hidden throughout the asteroid belt that could strike targets instantly across the entire solar system. The Wasp-class fighters had been designed and built during these frantic months. They were single-pilot craft that were small and fast and deadly. 300 of them sat ready in orbital hangars waiting for the call to launch. Each WASP carried missiles tipped with antimatter warheads and railguns that could punch through. Valorian armor, the crown jewels of the new fleet, were the 5 Titan-class warships that had been built in underground facilities and launched from Earth's surface. Each Titan was as large as a Valorian dreadnought and carried weapons that represented humanity's best work. The quantum singularity cannon mounted on each Titan could create and collapse a microscopic black hole and direct the resulting energy at enemy targets. When the Valorian reinforcements arrived, they would find a very different Earth than the one their first fleet had encountered. Humanity was ready and waiting, and this time they would not just defend their world. This time they would send a message that would echo across the galaxy. The Valorian Second Expeditionary Fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, and their arrival was like a storm descending upon a quiet ocean. 5,000 warships materialized in perfect formation, and each one burned with the fury of an empire that had been humiliated. Grand Admiral Corthan commanded the fleet from his massive flagship, and his anger was shared by every Valorian warrior under his command. The Emperor himself had given the orders, and they were simple, which was to make Earth an example that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Grand Admiral Corthan was older than Commander Zelthar had been, and far more experienced in the brutal art of conquest. He had personally overseen the destruction of 6 civilizations and the enslavement of billions. His reputation throughout the Empire was that of a commander who showed no mercy and accepted no excuses. When he learned that primitives had destroyed 300 Valorian ships, he did not believe it at first, but when the evidence was undeniable, his rage was terrible too. Behold, the fleet moved into the solar system with their sensors sweeping space for any sign of the defenses that had destroyed the first invasion force. Grand Admiral Corthan stood on his bridge surrounded by holographic displays showing every planet and moon and asteroid. He expected traps and hidden weapons and ships waiting to ambush his fleet. What he found was nothing. Earth sat alone and seemingly undefended in the third orbit from the sun. This is a trick, and they are hiding again just as they did before. Corthan spoke to his tactical officer with suspicion in his voice. Scan every inch of space around that planet and find their weapons platforms and their hidden fleet. The Valorian sensors were the best in the known galaxy, and they swept through the inner solar system looking for any sign of human defenses. They found abandoned weapons platforms that were clearly damaged and floating dead in orbit. They found debris fields from the first battle still scattered across space. They found nothing that posed a threat to 5,000 warships. Corthan was not a fool, and he knew that the absence of visible defenses meant nothing. The humans had surprised his predecessor, and he would not make the same mistake. He decided to draw them out by attacking something they would have to defend. Target the colonies on Mars and destroy them completely. Let the humans watch as we kill their people and burn their settlements. They will reveal themselves when they see their citizens dying. Mars had been partially terraformed over the past decades, and dome cities housed 50,000 humans who were working to make the red planet habitable. The Valorian targeting systems locked onto the largest settlement and began charging their plasma weapons. The attack would vaporize the domes and everyone inside them in seconds. The weapons fired, and brilliant beams of deadly energy crossed the distance between the Valorian fleet and Mars. The beams never reached their target. Something impossible happened, and the Valorian crews watched in shock as their plasma beams simply vanished. One moment the deadly energy was traveling through space, and the next moment it was gone, as if it had never existed. What they did not know was that humanity had deployed the Aegis array throughout the asteroid belt, and those quantum-entangled weapons platforms could strike anywhere in the solar system instantly. The Aegis array fired back, and 200 Valorian ships ceased to exist in the span of a single heartbeat. The beams appeared inside the Valorian shields and struck the ships from within. There was no defense against weapons that bypassed space itself. Reactors exploded and hulls shattered, and 200 crews died before they even knew they were under attack. Grand Admiral Corthan staggered as his flagship rocked from nearby explosions. His displays showed ships vanishing from his fleet roster faster than he could process. This was not possible, and no weapon system could do what he was witnessing. Where are those weapons platforms, and why can we not detect them? His sensor officer worked frantically at his station, trying to locate the source of the attack. Sir, the weapon signatures are coming from everywhere and nowhere. The beams are appearing instantaneously with no travel time. This technology should not exist. Before Corthan could respond, the moon revealed its secrets. 80 Sentinel ships burst from hidden positions and accelerated toward the Valorian fleet at speeds that violated every tactical doctrine the Empire had developed. The human ships moved like predators hunting prey, and their weapons blazed with deadly intent. Captain Daniel Wright commanded the entire Sentinel fleet from his upgraded flagship called Defiance. He had fought in the first battle, and he knew exactly how dangerous the Valorians could be when they were prepared. This time humanity had the advantage of surprise and overwhelming firepower. All ships engage and remember your training. Gold Squadron takes their dreadnoughts. Silver Squadron hunts their carriers. Red Squadron follows me, and we go straight for their command ship. The Sentinels dove into the Valorian formation, and the space between the ships filled with weapons fire. Plasma lances and kinetic rounds and missile swarms created a deadly ballet of destruction. The Valorian gunners tried to track the human ships, but the Sentinels twisted and rolled through space with impossible agility. Human pilots pulled maneuvers that would have torn Valorian ships apart from the stress. The Freedom under Captain Daniel Wright fired its railguns and launched penetrator rounds at a Valorian cruiser. The rounds struck with devastating force and punched completely through the alien ship. The cruiser broke apart and exploded in a ball of superheated gas. Another Sentinel called Victory caught a Valorian destroyer with concentrated beam fire and cut the ship in half. But the Valorians had learned from their first defeat, and this time they fought back with coordinated tactics and overlapping fields of fire. A massive Valorian dreadnought targeted the Sentinel ship Courage with its main cannon. The beam that struck the human vessel was powerful enough to overwhelm even advanced quantum shields. Courage was cut in two, and 73 crew members died instantly as their ship exploded. Commander Linda Foster piloted the Sentinel Determination, and she saw Courage die on her screens. They are using their numbers to box us in, and we cannot dodge forever. We need support, or we will be overwhelmed. Admiral Christine Ford watched the battle unfold from her command center, and she saw the danger immediately. The Sentinels were outnumbered 60-1, and even with superior technology, those odds would eventually destroy them. She gave the order that would change the course of the battle. Execute Operation Thunderstrike and launch all WASP fighters immediately. It is time to show them what a real swarm looks like. From hidden positions throughout the inner solar system, 300 WASP fighters launched simultaneously. The single-pilot craft were small enough that Valorian sensors had trouble tracking them, and fast enough that their weapons could barely target them. Each WASP carried a pilot who had trained for months in simulators and in actual spaceflight. They were the best humanity had to offer. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in the cramped cockpit of his WASP and felt the G-forces press him into his seat despite the inertial dampening. He had gone from detecting the first invasion to actually fighting in the second one. All WASPs, this is Jake Morrison, and we are going in hot. Remember to target their engines and weapons systems. Make every shot count because we only get one pass. The WASP swarm hit the Valorian fleet like a cloud of angry hornets. They were too small and too fast for the capital ships to target effectively. The fighters darted between the larger vessels and unleashed swarms of antimatter missiles. Each missile was tiny, but carried enough destructive power to cripple a Valorian destroyer if it hit the right spot. Explosions bloomed across the Valorian formation as the missiles found their targets. Engine sections were blown apart and weapon batteries were destroyed, and sensor arrays were turned to molten slag. The Valorians tried to shoot down the missiles, but there were too many coming from too many directions. Grand Admiral Corthan watched his carefully organized fleet descend into chaos. His ships were being attacked from multiple directions by enemies using tactics that the Empire had never encountered. He tried to organize a defensive formation, but before he could issue the orders, something new appeared on his sensors. 5 massive objects were rising from Earth's atmosphere on columns of nuclear fire. The Titans had been built in secret and hidden underground until this exact moment. Each one was as large as a Valorian dreadnought and carried weapons that represented the pinnacle of human engineering. Admiral Peter Grant commanded the Titan Colossus, and he watched his ship climb through the atmosphere with its hull glowing red from the heat. Around him, his crew worked with intense focus as they prepared for combat. The Colossus cleared the atmosphere, and its weapons came online with a hum that could be felt through the deck plates. Target the enemy flagship and prepare to fire the main weapon. Admiral Grant gave the order calmly, as if he was ordering coffee instead of preparing, to use the most powerful weapon humanity had ever built. The quantum singularity cannon charged and created a brief distortion in space that the Valorians detected too late. The weapon fired and a beam of impossible energy crossed the distance to Corthan's flagship in an instant. The beam carried the compressed fury of a collapsing black hole focused into a stream barely a meter wide. The Valorian flagship shields held for exactly 2 seconds before they failed catastrophically. The beam struck the hull and punched through armor that could withstand nuclear weapons. It penetrated deep into the ship and struck the main reactor chamber. The flagship exploded with the force of a small star-going supernova, and the blast consumed a dozen nearby vessels. Grand Admiral Corthan died without understanding how primitives had built weapons that surpassed anything the Empire possessed. His final thought was one of disbelief that his emperor had sent him to conquer gods instead of children. With their command ship destroyed, the Valorian fleet coordination collapsed. Individual captains made their own decisions, and some continued fighting, while others tried to retreat. But there was no escape from the combined fury of the Sentinel fleet, and the Wasp fighters and the Titan warships, and the Aegis array. 3 months after the Second Battle, Earth had transformed from a single-planet civilization into something that would have seemed impossible just a year before. Humanity had spread across the solar system like a species that had been caged for too long and finally set free. The dome cities on Mars expanded every week, and new settlements appeared on the moons of Jupiter. The asteroid belt became a vast industrial complex, where automated factories built ships and weapons around the clock. Stations orbited every major body in the solar system, and children were being born in space who would never set foot on Earth. But the greatest change was not physical but political. The United Nations had been reorganized into something new called the Terran Federation. Every nation on Earth sent representatives, but they served a single unified government whose only purpose was the defense and expansion of humanity. The old borders and conflicts still existed, but they seemed small and petty compared to the reality that humans now faced, which was that they lived in a galaxy full of other species, and some of those species wanted to destroy them. President Margaret Sullivan had been elected as the first chancellor of the Terran Federation in a vote that included every adult human regardless of where they lived. She stood before the Federation Assembly in the new capital complex that had been built in orbit and prepared to address the most important decision humanity had ever faced. We have won 2 battles against the Valorian Empire and destroyed 7,000 of their warships, but we know from intelligence gathered from captured ships that the Empire still has thousands more vessels, and eventually they will notice that 2 entire fleets have disappeared without sending any messages home. When that happens, they will come with everything they have, and the force they send might be too large for us to defeat even with all our preparations. She paused and looked at the faces of the representatives, who had come from every corner of Earth and every human settlement in space. We have 3 choices before us today. We can wait here and continue building defenses, hoping that we will be strong enough when they finally come. We can attempt to make contact with the Valorian Empire and negotiate some kind of peace treaty, or we can take the fight to them before they have a chance to organize another attack against us. The debate that followed lasted for 3 days, and every possible argument was made by passionate speakers. Ambassador Richard Cole argued that humanity should try to find allies among other species in the galaxy, rather than fight alone. General Vincent Hayes wanted to continue defensive preparations and turn the solar system into an impregnable fortress, but it was Dr. Lisa Bennett who presented the idea that ultimately won the vote. She stood before the assembly and spoke with the authority of someone who had studied the Valorian culture and psychology for months. The Valorian Empire has conquered 14 star systems because every species they encountered was weaker than them. They think in terms of predator and prey because that is all they have ever known. If we wait for them to attack us again, we will always be prey in their eyes. If we try to negotiate from a position of weakness, they will see it as confirmation that they can defeat us if they just send enough ships. But if we go to their home system and demonstrate our strength on their doorstep, then we change the entire equation. We show them that humanity is not prey, but a predator they cannot afford to provoke. The vote was close, but the decision was made. Humanity would launch its own expedition to the Valorian home system, not to conquer but to force a peace treaty from a position of strength. The Terran Expeditionary Fleet would be the largest and most powerful force humanity had ever assembled. Over the next 2 months, 100 warships gathered in orbit beyond Jupiter. 10 Titan-class dreadnoughts formed the core of the fleet, and each one carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon. 40 Sentinel ships provided speed and maneuverability. 50 support vessels carried supplies and equipment and repair facilities. The flagship of the fleet was a new vessel called Indomitable, and Admiral Christine Ford would command the entire expedition from its bridge. The fleet also carried people who were not warriors. Diplomats and scientists and linguists who would attempt to negotiate a lasting peace if the Valorians were willing to listen. Dr. Henry Clark led a team of engineers who would study any new technology they encountered. Cultural specialists prepared to learn about Valorian society, beyond what could be extracted from prisoners and computer. Captain Daniel Wright had been promoted to Commodore and given command of all Sentinel wings in the fleet. He stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable and watched the other ships moving into formation. This was the largest human fleet that had ever existed, and it was about to jump across 6 light years of space into completely unknown territory. Admiral Ford joined him at the window, and they stood together in silence for a moment. "You know, this could be a one-way trip, and we might be jumping into a system with defenses that make our battles here look like practice runs." She spoke quietly, but her voice was steady. Daniel nodded slowly. "I know, and so does everyone else on these ships. Every single person here volunteered knowing the risks. But someone has to go, and someone has to show the Valorians that Earth is not going to sit and wait to be attacked again. If we die doing this, then at least we die trying to secure a future for humanity, instead of just hoping the monsters do not come back." The departure was broadcast across every human settlement in the solar system, and millions gathered to watch. The fleet rose from orbit and moved to the edge of the solar system, where the gravitational forces were weak enough to allow safe hyperspace jumps. Then, in a spectacular display of light that could be seen from Earth with telescopes, the entire fleet engaged their faster than light drives simultaneously and vanished from normal space. The journey took 5 days of travel through hyperspace, which was a dimension where the normal rules of physics did not fully apply. The crew spent the time preparing for combat and running simulations of every possible scenario they might face. No one knew exactly what waited for them in the Valorian Ho. The system, and the uncertainty was worse than any battle. They emerged from hyperspace at the calculated coordinates, and what they saw made every heart sink. 3 inhabited planets orbited a yellow star similar to Earth's sun. Massive orbital stations surrounded each world, and some of them were larger than any structure humanity had built. Shipyards stretched across millions of miles of space, and new vessels were being constructed, even as the humans watched. And protecting it all was a defensive fleet that made the invasion forces look small. 15,000 Valorian warships sat in defensive formations around their homeworlds. For a long moment there was absolute silence on the bridge of the Indomitable. They had known intellectually that the Valorian Empire was vast and powerful, but seeing it with their own eyes was overwhelming. This was the heart of a civilization that had ruled the stars for centuries, and humanity had just appeared. Uninvited in their most sacred space, Admiral Ford took a deep breath and opened a communication channel that would broadcast on every frequency the Valorians used. Her words would be heard by every ship and every station and every settlement in the system. "People of the Valorian Empire, this is Admiral Christine Ford of the Terran Federation. We come not as conquerors, but as equals. You sent 2 fleets to enslave our world, and both were destroyed. We could have remained at home and waited for your next attack, but instead, we have come here to offer you a choice." On the surface of Valoria, Prime Emperor Tharn sat on his throne and watched the impossible sight of alien warships appearing in his home system. His military advisors were in complete chaos, and some demanded immediate attack while others counseled caution. The Emperor had ruled for 40 years, and he had never faced a situation like this. A species that should have been primitives had not only defeated 2 of his fleets, but had somehow built ships capable of traveling to his home and had the audacity to appear here as if they owned the space. Admiral Ford continued her message, and her voice was broadcast across the entire system. "We do not wish to be your enemies, but we will never be your subjects. We propose a treaty of mutual recognition and non-aggression between our peoples. We have much to offer each other through trade and cultural exchange and scientific cooperation. But if you choose war, then understand this. We will fight with every resource we possess, and we will not stop until either your empire falls or ours does. The choice is yours." To demonstrate her point, Admiral Ford gave an order, and the Indomitable fired a single shot from its quantum singularity cannon. The target was a small uninhabited moon on the outer edge of the system. The beam struck the moon and the massive rock cracked apart like an egg. Pieces of the shattered moon began drifting away from each other, and the demonstration was visible from every planet in the system. That was one shot from one ship, and we have 100 ships in this fleet. We can destroy everything you have built, or we can work together toward a future where both our species prosper. The decision is yours, but we will need an answer soon because we did not come here to wage war, but we are fully prepared to do so if necessary. The negotiations that followed took 3 weeks and they were tense and difficult. The Valorians had never negotiated with anyone from a position of anything less than total dominance. But they had also never faced an enemy that could appear in their home system and destroy their worlds if they chose to do so. Emperor Tharn met with his council and debated the options endlessly. In the end, survival won over pride. The Treaty of Valoria Prime was signed by Emperor Tharn and Chancellor Sullivan in a ceremony that was broadcast across both civilizations. The treaty recognized Earth and all human settlements as independent and sovereign. It established borders and trading rights and protocols for peaceful interaction. It created an embassy system where both species could learn about each other without conflict. Standing on the bridge of the Indomitable as the fleet prepared to return home, Admiral Ford looked at the stars and thought about how much had changed. A year ago, humanity had been alone and ignorant of the wider galaxy. Now they were a recognized power and had forced an empire to accept them as equals. The future was uncertain, and there would surely be other challenges and other species to meet. But humanity had proven something important. They had proven that they could not only survive but thrive when faced with extinction. Commodore Daniel Wright stood beside her and asked the question that everyone was thinking. What happens now that we have peace? Admiral Ford smiled and her answer was simple. Now we explore and we build and we learn. The Valorians taught us that we are not alone and that the galaxy is dangerous. But they also taught us that humanity has something special that no other species seems to possess. We refuse to accept defeat and we adapt to any challenge and we fight like hell when someone tries to take our freedom. That is what makes us human, and that is what will carry us to the stars.